All right, folks. Hello, happy Mondays. It's a beautiful one today. I want to thank you all for joining us. My name is Julia Scott, and I am going to be our leader, I guess our MC for today's wonderful event. I want to welcome you all to Baltimore Racial Justice Action's 13th of the month event, and this is our May event. Next slide, please. Just some virtual housekeeping. It is highly encouraged for folks to keep their video on. However, we also recognize you may not be comfortable with that. So if not, it is okay, but we do encourage it. Also, please mute yourself when you are not speaking. During our panel today, during our discussion today, we will have like some panelists. So just making sure that there's not any kind of feedback or anything happening when we're having our conversation. There will be an opportunity for our audience to ask questions, and you can certainly use the chat during your time today. So please just know that is available. Next slide. And as with all of our events, we just want to give a content and recording advisory. Obviously, we are recording. So given the historic and violent nature of racism in this country and how it's been perpetuated on Black and non-Black folks of color, people of color, an examination of history will be challenging and can be challenging for folks who are in the audience. And so because of this, we want to provide a content warning during our workshops and public offerings. We know that hearing about this violence, this history of violence against Black and non-Black people, these conversations can surface a lot of emotions, discomfort, pain, and we want to make sure that you're taking care of yourself during the conversation, however you need to, however you see fit, as long as you are not disrupting the work. So I want to make sure that folks are taking some time, taking a moment to assess whether you're emotionally ready to participate, or if this is the space for you right now. But that's want to make sure we have that cleared before we jump in. All right, next slide. All right, so you are here for what comes between us, Black immigrants and foundational Black Americans. This is our May offering, and we are really excited. And this is a topic I think that folks in BRJA, we've kind of circled around for a while now. And so to actually be able to talk about it is really, really exciting. So I want to welcome you all for this conversation. Before we kind of get started into our panel and start getting into, some of the questions and thoughts around this topic, I do want to, make a few kind of like, why do we even choose this topic to begin with? So look at the next slide. So this is a pretty intricate, I think, topic. It can go in multiple places. And in all honesty, we will not get a chance to finish everything today. I'm sure there are so many things that will be brought up. But one of the main reasons this topic is important to us is that we know that the Black community is not just one thing. A lot of the time when we are talking about the Black experience or the Black community, you might hear that on the news, you might see it in magazine articles. We know that the Black community is not just one thing. And so the Black community is multiple communities, whether you are born here, you are, a US born citizen, or you are someone who has immigrated here. And that all has different impacts on how you are treated or how you engage with the country itself. And so it's important, I think, as we're talking about Black communities and how we talk about liberation, how do we talk about anti-racism and anti-oppression, it is important for us to understand what that actually means, who is actually in that community. And so we also know that whether you are a foundational Black American, which you might hear us use throughout our time today, or FBA for short, or someone who has immigrated here, a Black immigrant, all of us share complex histories with the United States, whether that be, something that's welcoming when you come here, the kind of rollout carpet is open, where there's a safety situation and opportunity, or you have on the other kind of side of that a generation of enslavement and racial discrimination. So we want to make sure that those things are also lifted up as we're speaking today. We also have that these dynamics between these two groups can lead to intergroup conflict. And it's also important to recognize that while that conflict on its surface can seem like one thing, it is certainly playing into a larger white supremacy kind of issue. And so we want to explore some of those things and how that dynamic is actually at play. And using our ARAO, our anti-racist and anti-oppressive lens, I think can help us begin to unravel the nuances in these relationships and hopefully allow us to find common ground so we can continue to move forward. The last thing I will say is, if there are any white folks who have joined us today, for one, welcome. We want to make sure that you all know, as with everyone, that we are centering the voices of Black people, especially those who have lived experience with this topic today. So making sure that you are using this time to reflect and to listen. So as you're reflecting and listening to the conversation, these are a few questions you might, I think, want to think about as you're listening. In your experience, have you seen any difference between how foundational Black Americans are treated or Black immigrants are treated? Have you treated any of these groups differently or the same in your interactions? What have you seen in your institutions? What have you seen in your communities? What have you seen in possibly in policy? And how can this possibly strengthen your understanding and analysis in the future as you're working to unpack and undo any of your anti-racist work and your scope? So I want to get everyone on so we can do some introductions. So I guess we can stop sharing really quickly. Oh, or that works too. So for our wonderful panel, which I'm really excited, we have some folks that I think one person I haven't worked with, but the rest of them I know quite well. But the first one I'm going to introduce is Dr. Wendy Shaya. Do a nice clap for her. We also have Claire Minson here, and so I'm really excited to hear what Claire has to say. And of course, we have the always wonderful Anthony, who, just to see his face on the screen. So hello and welcome, folks. I'm gonna ask Rebecca to put the slides back up because we're gonna get into some data and some quotes really quickly. I think we still have people joining. All right, so next slide. All right, so before we actually even get into our conversation, I did want to do a kind of a quick data snapshot. So as of 2019, roughly 4.6 million, or 1 in 10 Black people living in the United States were born in a different country. And that is up from 3% since 1980. I really want us to think about actually how big of a number that is. So, when I mentioned when you're reading or hearing on the news, like, oh, well, Black America is this, that number, 4.6 million of those people that they're actually talking about are people who have immigrated to this country, folks who were born someplace else. And the US Census Bureau actually projects that this number will continue to increase to about 9.5 million, or could more than double those levels by 2060. So what we're actually seeing is we have, of course, like foundational Black Americans, those who have been born here, and we're seeing an increase in folks who are coming from other countries, whether that be from the Caribbean, whether that be from, Africa, the continent of Africa, coming to America and starting their life over, or making sure they have opportunity. And what does that actually mean for our country? Some of the key differences, this data is from the Pew Research Center. I didn't put all of the information there, but some of the key differences between these two groups is seen in the household income and our educational attainment. So Black immigrant-led households had a higher median household income in 2019 in comparison to those who were born in America, Black Americans. And more 25 and older Black immigrants have a college degree or higher than does the US born Black population. So folks are actually coming to America, they're already educated. So that is actually seen in the numbers. It has an impact on the income and their ability to live in this country. However, I do think it's important to point out a key difference. So, as America being a country of immigrants, that Black immigrant households' incomes are lower than that of the overall U.S. immigrant population, by varying amongst different origin groups. So even though Black immigrants are coming to America and they're doing well and their education, their, median income, in comparison to other immigrant groups, they are still at the lower kind of ring of those numbers. So it's important, I think, for us as we're talking about the impact that has and how racism, the systemic stuff starts to pop up. This is how it starts to show in that data. And then the next, we have Ta-Nehisi Coates, who was born and raised in Baltimore. And he wrote an article in 2009 called "Why Do Black Immigrants Do Better Than Native Blacks?" And his opening, he said, "It always seemed to me that the question answers itself. An immigrant is someone who specifically comes to this country to capitalize and exploit opportunity. Comparing any immigrant group to virtually any native-born group is like comparing the most ambitious members of one team with the entirety of another team. This is to say nothing of whatever skills, education, and wealth a particular immigrant may bring to bear." And so I think that's actually a really good opener about what does it mean to come to America. America has a lovely mythology of what it is, and then folks come here and they have maybe a good experience or a bad experience. But we want to get into what does it actually mean to be, whether you're a foundational Black American or a Black immigrant coming to America. We definitely know, however, that we're all Black in America. So whoever you are, whoever you think you are, when you come here, you are a Black American, you are an American, and we're all Black. So we want to get into what does it actually mean. So I'm going to have Wendy maybe start. Reading this quote and maybe talking a little bit more about your experience of, immigrating here to America. What has been your experience?
Thank you so much, Julia. So I was born in England. My family's Jamaican. I grew up in Jamaica for the most formative years of my life. I came to the States when I was 14, and I came to New York City. So this quote is something that I have always thought about. For my family, what it took to be able to get yourself together, to move across the world, it takes a lot. And what I have found is that it doesn't matter whether as immigrants we came with lots of resources with a green card, or whether we came on a visitor visa and just overstayed, or whether we came through Texas with a mule, right? It doesn't matter how you got here. The fact is that in order to be able to get here, you had to have an incredible amount of intrinsic motivation and or support in order to get here, even if the process of getting here was not easy, and even if you came without money. So I think that is something I have always thought about, because I have left behind lots of family in Jamaica who don't have the experiences, the support, and or the motivation to make that trip. So I'll stop there and pass it on to others for comment.
All right, yeah, so that makes a lot of sense. Claire.
Yeah, I think I have multiple thoughts. So I'm pausing to not follow all 3 different pathways my mind wants to take me. So I currently live in Colorado, was born in the Bahamas, and actually still a Bahamian citizen, but have permanent residency, completed high school, undergrad, graduate degree, all in America. One child was born in the Bahamas, but raised here, and the second child born here. So just wanted to set that context for how I've been navigating. And when I think about this, not only this quote, but the comments Wendy just made, I mean, much of my experience or recollection, I'm thinking about, it was kind of commonplace for my peers, and there's a class dynamic here, but it was commonplace or income context, my commonplace for my peers to come to America or Canada, largely America, for some high school to complete high school, majority to complete some kind of college degree, right? Or start the process at least. So it was automatically, I mean, it was just commonplace. It was like, you know, this is what you do if you can afford it. And even if you can't afford it, figure out the scholarship and come to America for opportunity. But I think Wendy is right in terms of the intrinsic motivation to leave behind an entire community and village of people and come to a country that purports to be, and in some instances, the land of opportunity, although that opportunity looks different depending on the particular racial group you're assigned to, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think that the idea of like leaving a community and then coming here, especially, you know, like I said, we talked about the American mythology, what you think it's possibly going to be versus what it actually is when you get here, I'm sure is also something where it's like, oh, like what's happening? And I wonder, obviously, like how does that also impact your ability to move, or like do you second guess? So you're like, oh, well, is this really the place? So I'm also going to open this up to Anthony. I would love to hear Anthony's thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you. I am foundational Black American. I grew up in, I always say, the tri-state area and say that that's important, where DC, Maryland, and West Virginia meet. It's literally the county that I grew up is where the John Brown raids and hangings took place. And I say that in that we're only about an hour away from DC and Baltimore. And so growing up in elementary to junior high, the town that I lived in county was pretty much just Black and white. And then during the housing boom, there were more folks moving from DC and Baltimore to buy cheaper houses and just commute for work. And that racially diversified the neighborhood in which I grew up in. And so growing up, even though there were uh, mostly Caribbean folk as far as immigrants in our county, the message was that we were all still Black. Um, And then I started having these conversations, young adult, about how we all need to work 10 times harder. But Black immigrants were saying that you don't know how good you all have. You're not working as hard. This is the American dream. You all are lazy. And so it was kind of like the first time of me getting a mixed message of like, hey, I thought we all were Black. I thought we all get treated the same way. And so I think that was the first time that I was like, oh, this is confusing. And there was some type of, oh, there's a splinter or differentiating between we're not all just the same type of quote unquote Black. And
Yeah.
so that's what this quote makes me think of here. And it also like pulls me to I think at that time I couldn't name it, but the pull yourself up by the bootstraps theory. That
Yeah.
also, now I'm looking back at it, I was like, oh, that was also like that moment that those people that I were speaking to, you know, part of that American dream is come pull yourself up by the by your both straps. And you all have been here all this time. Why are you all in the same place? Kind of messages.
Yeah.
So I'll stop there.
Yeah, I'll say from my own experience, I'm born and raised in Baltimore, and my first kind of real experience, I think, with Black immigrants was at Morgan State University when I went to college. And of course, like, you know, it's really exciting, right? Because you're like, oh, you know, there's all sorts of people from all sorts of backgrounds. That's what college is. And it wasn't until we started having conversations where I was oh, okay. So apparently we're not all the same here. And I think especially going to an HBCU, it felt really, really important to be around other Black folks. And then I was told like, oh, I'm not Black. I was like, oh, okay, I thought you were. I'm so sorry. And that was kind of my first, you know, experience of just like the two groups and some of the tension, I think, between those groups. And definitely, I think what you just said, Anthony, like hearing like, oh, well, we're lazy, we're not smart, we don't do anything. You know, like that's why folks were able to come over here and take our opportunities. And I was always just kind of sitting there like, what is happening right now? And considering that I graduated from Oregon in 2009, I really wish I would have seen this Coates article then, but I did not. So certainly something that is kind of you know, really impactful in my understanding of like what it meant to be Black at that time and how those differences really started coming up for me. One of the things that I really wanted to speak about is, you know, we talked about we're all Black in America. You know, no matter where you come from, that's how people engage with you. And I really wanted to hear, particularly from Claire and Wendy, what were some of the maybe messages that you heard or experienced about Black Americans, and how did that inform maybe your engagement with them when you came here?
Wendy, you want to jump in first? Or?
Go for it, Claire.
I am thinking this is a really good question. I don't know what the earlier, like I can't place messages in my kind of early history. But I was smiling when Anthony mentioned, you know, not having the framing of pull yourself up by the bootstrap, but hearing the language of it, I guess, so to speak, or that mythology, that framing, that you know, myth of meritocracy, really in many ways. And I think my awareness of kind of the way in which Black immigrants and foundational Black Americans were being divided or pit against one another, so to speak, happened in college. So I finished high school in Baltimore and did not necessarily have the language or awareness per se, although my experience with, this is kind of now jogging my memory, my experience with my classmates in high school was one that there was this level of ignorance about the way that Black people in other countries outside of America lived, right? And a lot of stereotypes that I had to confront about, you know, or I thought all Bahamian people were like really dark skinned, and I thought all Bahamian people like live outside, right? Like these crazy notions. And I'm like, what in the world? Like how, you know, so there was this, for me, like, these folks have a limited viewpoint and experience and a level of ignorance that I had not really encountered up to that point. But when I got to college, feeling that divide and really wanting to be on the side, distance myself, right, from the stereotypes about being lazy, right, and the ideas that that are ascribed to foundational Black Americans in particular. And so I could hear more of that in my college experience. And then as I transitioned into the workplace in particular, right, I just melted in and became Black before anything else, and continued to hear, and even in many ways in that role early on, perpetuated some of those stereotypes. So I don't even know if that answered your question, but that's where all my mind went as you asked.
Oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like that is, I think, it makes sense, I think, of the story that I have heard. And I think on my kind of like, you know, experience as a Black American, we get a very limited view of what other countries, particularly, you know, like predominantly Black countries, are. Like, you know, so one of the things that I know that Adar has said in the past, like one of the biggest exports that America has is white supremacy and anti-Blackness. And that is included in like the stories and the histories that you receive, you know, the media that you consume. And I think that kind of goes both ways, because I know for a very long time, like the only thing that I knew about the Caribbean was like, oh, like it was Bob Marley, it was Jamaicans, and like Cool Runnings. It was like a very big thing when I was coming up. And so when people started talking about other places, I was like, oh, like Jamaica, they're like, I'm not Jamaican. Oh, I didn't know. So yeah,
It's fighting
absolutely.
words. If you're not Jamaican, them it's fighting words.
Oh yeah, I know. I mean, all the Jamaicans loved it, but the other ones did not. Like, sorry to my Trini people, I apologize. Wendy, I would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, this is so complex because growing up, you know, my parents wouldn't let us have a television, but every once in a while I would get to watch a neighbor's television. And it was so amazing how quickly those images of foundational Black Americans as sort of shuffling, not too smart, kind of like, you know, even this, I mean, you have to admit this, a lot of the sitcoms in the 70s didn't always portray Black people as particularly sort of dignified, smart, right? And so that's what we saw. And it was interesting because I didn't have a television, but boy, I tell you, just a couple of minutes of catching television, and those images were so strong for me. And, you know, so I was growing up in Jamaica, and then I went back to England, and then I came here to the States. But when I was, before we moved here, we came for a visit to New York, to the Bronx. And I remember these kids were outside, it was summertime, it was hot. These kids were outside playing in the fire hydrant. And I was like, I want to go outside and play. And my father was like, we do not play with those children. And I was like, why don't we play with these children? He couldn't tell me. It wasn't until later on that I began to understand, as Adar has said, that the greatest export from the United States is anti-Black racism, and that my father had absorbed that. And at the same time, this is where it gets complicated, because I went back to England before I came here, and I was in England, having come from a Black country and I had gone to England where the expectation was that I was dumb and I was, you know, not able to hold my own. And so then I found myself in a lot of fights, right? When my parents said we are moving to the States, I was like, no, I'm not moving because I got some white butt to kick here in London, right? And I was like, I am staying because I have some butt to kick. My parents made me move, but the other side of it was that coming to a country where foundational Black Americans had, were in communities where people had been fighting for liberation, was in some ways a safety for me, right? Because I could go into a Black community and be lost, and yet at the same time, nobody could understand what I was saying. I couldn't understand what the Americans were saying. We were talking to each other like we were two different languages. I went to school. I learned very quickly that my British accent was not going to help me in Jamaica, Queens, and that I quickly lost that very quickly. It was a matter of survival. So, you know, so this is right. It's very complicated. It's not cut and dry. All the racism is being exported. And at the same time, very often when we come here, there's a level of safety being in a Black community, right? But whoever is living in that community, and that community is usually foundational Black Americans and Black immigrants together. And that was definitely the case in New York in a lot of communities. So yeah, it's really complex.
Right. And I think I think what you just said is like, you know, it's a matter of survival, right? That it's like the idea that coming here and having to survive, like, okay, if you're sending money back home, if you're trying to support folks back home, that has an impact on, like, well, I got to make sure I'm crossing all my T's and dotting my I's. And yet, like, maybe part of the negotiation of that survival is, I don't want to be affiliated with these foundational Black Americans who are also trying to survive, right? And not being allowed to, not, being able to survive in this space. And yet community, right, is definitely needed, because we know, like, a lot of the things that, like, my mom and my dad will always say is like, well, they can act different, but they'll find out soon enough that they're going to need safety, right? Like, from us, because, we know how this country works. Like, so I'm not sure how the white folks work in your country, but over here, this is how the game is actually played. So it's actually really interesting to kind of, thinking about safety and survival and what do those things actually mean, particularly I think between if we're all Black, what does that look like? And like, how does survival look different for each group? Anthony, what are some of your thoughts on this before we move to the other nuances in this relationship?
I think y'all touched on most of it. I was thinking about kind of conversations that I had with friends that I think mostly pointed at the safety piece, the assimilation piece of we can't go out with you, or my parents don't want me to go out. I'm talking young adulthood, and kind of like creating that distance, and me walking away with, like, you all are just trying to be as white as you can be, but you'll never be white. but also like the things that you're mentioning, the risk of what happens if you're in a car full of other Black men, right? Police are just going to see Black men, and what does that mean for you and your family, right? I'm also thinking about the protection that I did not have this at the time period, the protection that the parents were trying to create, or some type of, I guess, like guardrail for them to be able to hold what was important as far as tradition, right?
Mhm.
And that I couldn't receive it then, but their parents were saying, we know that you were going to, embed certain American cultures and ways, but we're trying to set certain things so you remember that you are Jamaican, or that you are, and so I even question sometimes, like, why don't we go to the same place of worship? We're both Christian, we're both Black. Like, there's things like this. What about like the dinner? Can't we have like shared dinner? So there are also these pieces that I think now, and I look at it, I'm like, oh, it's complicated. But before I was just like, oh, you are so determined just not to be Black American and distance yourselves from them, that I have a different respect and look at differently now. So.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Yeah, because I think that it came off as like, oh, you want to be white. And us knowing, I think, some of the background and the like the nuance, like relationship of like, what does it mean to immigrate to a place and to try to survive said place? When you're younger, it's just that's not what you're thinking of. You're just like, you want to talk to people, and this person has kind of rebuked you. And when you call them Black and they say, I'm not Black, what does that do? Where you're kind of like, oh, okay, well, we'll see. And that I think kind of creates that tension. I do see someone's hand raised. I do want to kind of get that question in. Moses? All right, you got the floor.
Yeah, hello everyone. Hello. My name is Brother Mac Moses. I am a bi-ethnic Black person of African descent. My father was born and raised in Panama, and my mother was born in Pennsylvania, and they met in Brooklyn. Brooklyn is the place to be. Um, I know, and I was raised in a family of Garveyites. My father's people, they were Garveyites. And growing up, I had a lot of issues, particularly with my mother's side of the family. My grandparents did not like West Indians. And so I remember being called Goya Bean. Um, I remember a lot of derision around my religion. I was baptized and raised, born in Roman Catholic. And so my mother's side was Protestant, Baptist, and Seventh-day Adventist. And so what I realized was that the devil has played a trick on us. And because I believe in the unity of African people worldwide, these divides really trouble my heart. Because at the end of the day, we are all Black people. I've met Panamanians that look like me and say they're not Black, but then they realize how Black they are when they go on to these PWIs. And so my hope is that dialogue like this will bring us closer together as a global people so that we can defeat the nefarious forces that seek to divide us. And we also have to remember we are the global majority. And them other folks are the global minority, and they have always been a global minority on the planet Earth. And they need to be reminded of that because they do not play nice with other people. So it behooves us to dig into our humanity and to really coalesce as a people, because it is very clear that the powers that be, the global minority of Europeans, are really in desperate rates right now, and doing everything they can to stop our growth. But I do know this: by 2050, 1 out of every 3 people on this planet will be African, and they cannot stop it at all.
All right, well, thank you, Brother Moses. I appreciate your comments and sharing your thoughts. And we're definitely going to get onto, I think, some of the connections that we all share. You brought up like Marcus Garvey. We're going to talk about folks, Black immigrants and how they've been involved in civil rights struggle, like in liberation struggles here. in America. So let's also get into some of the nuances, right, of what does it mean to be a Black immigrant and, versus the FBA here. So we know that all this like citizenship and like permanent residency, we also know that this has a huge impact. I think we went over those numbers on policy, right? Like, how does this impact our policy going forward, immigration policy, but just like every single day policy. If a majority of the Black people in this country are actually not born here, what does that mean for their understanding of their connection to like American chattel slavery, how that has informed our relationships in the Black community and the American Black community. And, we're seeing, for example, a fight for education. Like, we see in Florida, for example, like they're saying that we gained skills when we were enslaved. But if you don't have that connection, right, to that history, and you're living in a state like Florida and you're going to vote, how does that have an impact on, well, you may say, well, that's really not that big of a deal to me. Like that doesn't matter. How does that actually inform and impact one's understanding of this country and how we are being honest about it? So I want to get into some of the nuances about like assimilation. Like, what does it mean to assimilate into US citizenship? So I'll start with you, Claire, because I feel like I always start with Wendy. I'm going to start with you. What are
I
some of
felt
those
it coming.
nuances you're seeing?
I felt it coming, and I think it's an appropriate question because, I really, I think came into much more conscious awareness of just navigating racism in America in college. I wrote about this a few years ago about the ways in which our kind of post-secondary institutions really like are seeding ground for this intergroup conflict. Let's see, I lost the question. Say the question again for me
So
one
yeah,
more
like
time.
what do you think about the
Oh.
nuances of like, assimilation,
Yeah.
policy? How does that all, impact you or like what you have seen?
Yeah, so I mean, so if I'm entering an environment that says I am better than the people who look like me, and I internalize that, then I start that informs then the decisions I make around friendships, that informs the decisions I make around workplaces, that informs the decisions I make around if I'm eligible to vote, who I'm voting for and how I'm voting. I was talking to a person of Haitian origin. He was born in Haiti, but then immigrated to America, has American citizenship, and even his thinking about voting and aligning with a particular party, because he's divorced of the particular history in America, foundational Black Americans, right? And has internalized in many ways the stereotypes, the mythology, the biases, and then regurgitates those as if they are normal and true, without any examination or analysis, and then is raising kids, right? So this is not just like in one generation, this then continues to perpetuate and play out across and throughout generations, right? And so, and while these stereotypes that are not true continue to sink further and further in our kind of national narrative, when we can be so much more powerful in actually disrupting, right? Seeing the ways in which we are more alike than different, the ways in which we are the global majority, and the ways that we can work together to actually move us towards, if you will, fight, advocate for liberation, both here and globally, if you will.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I don't think the person I know is Haitian, but certainly an experience of like how folks, Black immigrants have voted. And of course, I think it's important for people to have their whatever their outlook is, but it is like divided from understanding like what does that actually do, not just like to the Black Americans who've been here, but a lot of the ones that I know, they have children here. Right. And I'm like, well, to me, when I'm speaking about, I'm like, this is setting not just me, but your kids up for failure. Like these are policies and rules that are going to impact us going forward. But it's because we don't, want to have the hard conversation of, well, this is what this country has actually done to these people. This is what it's done to us. This is what it has continuously done to us. And so therefore, we can't like just vote ourselves out of racism, Like, I wish that was possible, but that's just not it. And so when we're talking about it, it's really important for us to recognize that. And like, I definitely want to touch on like children and how that, of course, looks different from someone who is moving their child here and moving themselves here, and then they have a child here. And it's like, well, your child is now technically a Black American. You know, if they're not like, you know, Trinidadian or Jamaican, they're not Nigerian. What does that do? Right? Like, how does that impact, you know, like just the discourse that happens in the home? I'm always wondering about. Wendy, like, would you like to share?
Yeah, thanks. I agree with everything Claire said. You know, so many of us in the Caribbean, and I would dare say a lot of people on the continent of Africa also, we have learned to take on some of the analysis of our oppressors. So many of us have a colonial mindset. You know, you know, my parents' generation, you know, as Jamaicans, they were British citizens because their colonizers gave them citizenship. And there is some sort of cachet in that for a lot of people, right? So this idea that I really belong to the Queen and I really am one of the Queen's subjects becomes sort of something that we internalize and we take on so much. I always say that sometimes the Jamaicans are more British than the British. When I go home to Jamaica, I am pretty blown away at how, like, I'm like, y'all, we are in Jamaica. We are not in London right now. You know, like, but it is a real experience for people. And so we bring that colonized mindset with us. And that colonized mindset says you should be able to pull yourself up by the bootstraps, that you should be able to do all these things. And so we come over with that and we just sort of, you know, I think that the colonial mindset is all about self-hatred personally. You know,
Absolutely.
there's a lot of sort of, you know, hearing the messages over and over again in our own caste system in the Caribbean that says these people are better than and these people are less than. And so we just kind of, it's very easy to internalize that and then we bring it with us. Right. And so that colonial mindset gets played out in this country in very, very often. I find myself talking to my family or to, you know, to friends who are from the continent of Africa who are just like, I don't understand this racism business. Why are you all always talking about racism? And that's that ahistoric, you know, view of the world of what this country has been through. Without that historic view, it's very hard to have the analysis that really speaks to what foundational Black Americans have been through. And so for those of us who are coming from with that colonized mindset, we have sort of internalized this idea that, you know, you can be the Queen's subject too if you work hard enough, right? And so bringing that over and playing that out, which is unfortunate because at the end of the day, we are all Black. And I will tell you that I learned very quickly that despite all the different, we may sound different. I just really quickly, the day after we came to this country, my father went outside and there was some, you know, we were in Jamaica, Queens. So there were some older Black men sitting around outside. Now in England, and especially at the point that I came here, you know, you could meet any Black person, you'd know they were an immigrant. So you could speak to them and throw a little patois in there and there'd be sort of like, oh yeah, I see you, I see you. So my father goes up to these African-American men, he starts talking to them in patois. And they're like, right? And it was this moment where he realized that there were differences between us. Even though in his head he knew that, you know, he had sort of absorbed that colonized mindset. And then we get here and it's you know, there's a language barrier, there's all this stuff. And it's very easy to then insert all that stuff that you learned from the colonizers into the space there, instead of really getting to know history and really understanding how our groups are different, but in so many ways, how we're similar, how we all fought for liberation, how we all, you know, had to go through this process of being liberated from chattel slavery. So, you know, there are so many similarities, but if you don't have that history clear and you can't speak to it, we can't get to the point where we begin to see where there are similarities and where there are differences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. What I'm glad that we're, because we were going to talk about some of the connections, but I think that, kind of talking about this wedge or this separation first is actually really important. And I saw, I think it might have been Dawn B, in the chat talking about, we're talking about the colonized mind and bringing that kind of colonized mindset wherever we go, particularly for Black immigrants. But that's certainly, I think, something that Black Americans also experience, right? We have been, just like you all were getting TV shows about Black Americans, whether it be in the 70s or whatever, we certainly have a very limited view of, particularly, I think, the continent of Africa and who's there and what that looks like. And so, I mean, I know at one point I was on social media and there's always a lot of conversations between, as we call them, diaspora wars or diaspora wars, on Twitter, and it will be someone like, oh, I was called an African booty snatcher when I was younger and I was in grade school. And I was like, how did everybody use that term? Like, where did that term even come from? But a lot of it is because, Black Americans, a lot of us may have not had like an understanding. Now, I had some, but that certainly doesn't stop you, I think, from swallowing a lot of, colonized rhetoric that is harmful. So for Anthony, I wanted to know, what is, I think, maybe your experience, I think, as Black Americans, like for the colonized mind, and how does that actually impact our relationship with folks who are Black immigrants?
Yeah, for the I was thinking about the recent question that you asked to tying that to this,
Mhm.
and growing up with, it was no question that I grew up in a country in which white supremacy and anti-blackness, those systems were at work to oppress us, right? And so there were different stages in my life in which I was able to see the depth or power in which that had, and then what that meant for me and whatever age that I was. But it was also a beautiful and painful thing to experience with my friends that were immigrants when they finally started to see that,
Mm.
oh, this is at work, right? Oh, I was like, again, fed back to the mythology of the American dream. And then also thinking about how they were unlearning most of the time by themselves because their
Yes.
parents were already invested, right? And how much of a long period, how much of a whiplash that was going to be before they were going to be able to kind of like build this consciousness, and also battling with family in this very kind of unique place of wherever they were, because I'm not foundational Black American, right? And so that's where that question took me at,
Mm.
and thinking about the increase of immigration in the US. And then ask the second part of your question again. There was a thread there.
Oh, I was asking just about like what do you think that this kind of tension creates, right? So your experience of like the colonized mindset, I think, in Black Americans, I'll actually use an example. I mentioned that I went to Morgan and there were a lot of like Black immigrants who I went to school with. And obviously, we would talk about these things and we still talk about them. But one of the things that I always heard was, even from Black folks who worked at HBCUs, when they were trying to get immigrant students, they would go and tell them like, oh, well, we need y'all because y'all are going to help us with like, the education and keeping our numbers up because, those Black Americans, like, they're not as smart. So we need you all to boost and I was like, so not only are you hearing this from like, usually like white people, right? Or white media, predominantly white media, but you have like someone who is a Black American coming to your home, coming to your country and saying this. Why wouldn't you believe that, right? And then also like, why is it even in our wonderful institutions like our HBCUs, why do we feel comfortable perpetuating that in order to gain folks to come to our school? Like that is something that is very uncomfortable. It's easy, I think, to say, well, they're just trying to get folks to come to the school. Like that's just a part of the process. but how harmful that is, how that reinforces these harmful stereotypes, and what does that do, I think, for like furthering the tension in those relationships between foundational Black Americans and Black immigrants?
I think I think about labor, and I really think about Black Latinos and the tension that existed there around, oh, Black Americans are too lazy or they won't take these jobs, when actually it was these jobs were unsafe. You're not paying us what we're supposed to be paid. We know as being foundational Black Americans what the laws are. And then have an immigrant say, I'm getting paid, and so I'm able to take this. And so it just kind of like that was the false narrative that white supremacy set up. That was the hostility that kind of formulated between those two groups. And so I see those ways that those narratives come up, that if we do not layer back and look into the full scope of what policy is happening, what history is present here, then we leave with, well, these two groups don't get along, and it's all over labor because this group is still in this group's job, and this group thinks that they're too lazy, right?
Right.
And so, yeah, I'll stop
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, I think that actually brings up a really good question. And we had talked about this kind of, I think, previously, but particularly I think around like class, right? So we went over that data with, oh, well, Black immigrants are like the household median income is this in comparison. But, and you brought up labor and the jobs that Black immigrants are actually taking. And I know that Wendy and Claire, we had kind of talked about this, but even with those jobs, not all of those jobs are that these folks are taking are like A+, like they're going to be a VP of a program, but these are jobs that they need to survive as well. And so what does that, I think, and I brought up that that number around, even though Black immigrants in comparison to Black Americans are doing this, in comparison to all immigrants, like Black immigrants are still at the bottom. And like what is happening there, like why is that happening, is the real question. Because if we say that racism is not a thing, as like I've heard all sorts of people tell me, and yet in every group, whether you're a Black immigrant or foundational Black American, those numbers tell a very different story about, I think you had said, Wendy, that like a lot of Black immigrants clean people's backsides when they come here. And so like, what does that actually, I think that kind of adds like to maybe the resentment too, because it kind of comes to this like, well, I'm not over here just doing whatever. I'm doing a lot of hard work. I'm trying to like make sure I can survive here. And that I think just adds to that kind of horizontal hostility I think that you had brought up, Anthony, earlier. Okay. So one of the other
I'm sorry, can I ask a question?
Go ahead.
Thank you, because in talking about the class conversation, right? Even in the class conversation, regardless of class that we're talking about, the stereotypes still come into play. Because if it is an immigrant that is wiping people's backsides, there still is the, oh, wow, they're working hard. They are willing to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, right? They just got here and they're willing to work hard. If it is an FBA wiping people's backsides, it is either, this is why they're always staying in poverty because they don't aspire to do anything else, or they're uneducated, or they're too lazy to do whatever. So even when we're talking about class, there still is this stereotyped component that always enters the conversation, especially when the white gaze is on these groups of people, right? And then that white gaze and that framing, that whiteness framing of the conversation plays into how these two groups are dealing with each other. So regardless of how we're slicing this particular piece of pie, we can never get away from the ways in which how each group has been stereotyped steps into the conversation. So that's one thing. My question for you all is, if we are all agreeing that we are all Black, then why has the Pan-African movement really been stifled, not only in the United States, but also in the Caribbean and in different countries in Africa? Thoughts?
It's a really good question. And of course, Adar asked it, so I don't know who wants to go first.
Let's let Moses take a stab at it. Moses has their hand up.
Moses' hand popped up, so listen. Okay, Moses, you got the floor.
Thank you, Adar, for that question. I think a lot of the basis for the
Oh, I think you're muted, Brother Moses. Yeah, I think you might be frozen.
Brother Merrick, where are you?
Oh, you're
Brother,
frozen.
Brother Merrick, you froze. So could you start at the beginning, please? We don't want to miss anything.
religion.
X unmute. I'm not sure what happened, but
He's frozen.
when he comes back, we will make sure to.
Really is the colonizer's religion.
Oh, there he is. Oh, I feel like he froze again.
Oh, no.
Oh, no. Well, what I will do is we can come back and hopefully their internet or whatever the case may be is better. And I'm gonna have, I think Anthony, were you about to say something before or? Oh, yeah, another.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm having some internet issues, but I was
Listen,
saying
it
that
happens.
I believe that religion has a lot to do with it. I believe that the white Jesus has killed the minds of Black people. And as a result of that, you have people aspiring to whiteness because they believe whiteness is equal to divinity. And I bring this up to say that I was on Twitter a couple of months ago, and there was an African brother. I feel like he was Nigerian, but I'm not sure. And he was dating a white girl. I believe it was his fiance. And he said out of his own mouth, I am marrying someone who looks like Jesus. When I tell you my heart was burning with rage, I had to really sit with myself because I thought that was such a disgusting and abhorrent thing to say. But as I played it back in my mind, what I realized was, one, this person is completely and utterly compromised. Two, Nigeria has the largest statue of Jesus on the continent of Africa, and it is alabaster white. The problem is this: when we equate divinity with whiteness, it leaves us in a space of self-hatred, and it calls for us, that white image calls for us to literally stop being who we are as African people. So I do believe that the undergirding of the corruption of Christianity by use of the white gaze and the propaganda around that has caused a fracturing. We can't agree on anything because we're fighting over this denomination or that denomination. And I haven't even brought up the Islamic question and how that in and of itself as well has divided African people. So I think that when we talk about what this looks like, we have to talk about how these faiths have pulled us apart in a lot of ways. But if we develop our own authentic Christianity or Islam or a religion or a faith space that affirms us as African people, we can unite on the core of our identity. But I think that this idea around religion, particularly Europeanized satanic Christianity, has done a number on our hearts and our minds. And we have to divest ourselves from that toxic thinking.
Thank you so
Yeah, I so appreciate that because in the United States and globally, Christianity has always walked hand in hand with white supremacy. And we tend to forget how it has been weaponized and continues to be weaponized, right? In order to keep people in line with whiteness practices. So you're bringing that up. Thank you so very much. Really appreciate that.
Yeah, I think I think that is so many things actually, Adar. I know there was a book I was reading earlier this year called Tip of the Spear, Black Radicalism, Prison Repression in the Long Attica Revolt. And that book gets into, of course, like how the prison system was used not just to jail criminals, but also to suppress Black radicalist thought, right? Like we saw in like the 70s, like this kind of rising, like, well, we can go here, where, they were actually communicating with folks on the continent. They were actually looking at these things, and part of like prisons, right, was about, well, we can just jail these people. And so I think they're also looking at our prison system, our criminal justice system, as I think part of the reason, as an answer to your question, that these kind of like radical kind of movements end up being fractured. Because if we lock the folks up, they can say, well, they don't have any access to them, they don't have access to the information. And so that's also, I think, another part. But I would also love to hear from Claire, Wendy, or anything. And I think I see Tim's hand is raised.
Yeah. Can I just say that we forget that the Panthers were that movement and where the leaders went was global. And from the time that they stepped into Libya, there was an issue. Their sojourn into Cuba, their sojourn into different countries in Africa made them even more dangerous. So this point that you're making, Julia, is it has legs. It resonates. Thank you.
No problem.
I even just wanted to add just that, I think across the African diaspora that's outside of Africa, there are so many beliefs and stereotypes about what Africa is. So first of all, Africa is not a country, but we still have people who are talking about Africa as if it's one country and not a continent of many different cultures. But the idea of, even in this country, even in the Caribbean, there's still a lot of stereotypes about what is happening in Africa, right? So this idea that there could be a homeland for us, for many of us, this is not a strange idea, right? This is a homeland, we want to go there. But for many of us, that is so out of the realm of possibilities because we're still thinking swinging on trees, right? And so what would we want to go there for? Why would that be any better than being where we are right now? So a lot of this sort of history and geography and knowledge, it's one of the reasons I write fiction, because I want to try to sort of like insert some of this knowledge and for people who aren't normally going to read this stuff, because our children are still thinking that people in Africa are swinging in trees.
Yeah.
Wherever they are in the continent. And so that impacts, and it's the same thing across, I hear it in the Caribbean. Well, do you all in Jamaica, do you all have, you have electricity? What do you all have? And, sometimes I've gone home with Americans and I'm just kind of like having to remind them that like these streets were built by architects and engineers and, there's knowledge here. We don't need to come and explain all this. So there's still very much that sense of, we are better off the closer we are to the Europeans. And so Pan-Africanism could seem for a lot of, whether we're Black immigrants or foundational Black Americans, it's just way out.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up. Especially, I think I see a lot of people, a lot of Black Americans. I think there was an argument just about the artist Tyla, and how, she's South African, but she is colored, right? So she is colored and she has identified herself as colored. And a lot of Black Americans, we did not know that, because she is PR-wise as a new artist, she is being marketed as a Black person. Like, I don't, it's like, and so I think we were trying to explain, like, well, like, I hope that y'all know that she's not gonna go on Jimmy Kimmel and she's gonna say, oh, he's, as a colored person, what is it, like, he's not gonna say that. It's like, so, you know, we recognize, of course, that race and how we discuss it maybe in an American sense operates differently in other places. And however, when folks come here, like, this is what, like, is as limited as it may feel and be, this is what it is. I think that that has an impact. And so for me, I was like, it also shows that as Black Americans, we need to make sure that we're learning more about folks, you know, our brothers and sisters, you know, from other places, and how race and class and all of these identities actually, I think, work in those places. So we have an informed discussion. So we have a better understanding. So when it gets time to actually work together, that's one thing we don't necessarily have to worry about squaring out, because we're actually being able to say, okay, well, I understand what you're saying from this point of view. And I think that's going to
Julia,
be
can
really
I
important.
piggyback on there?
Mhm.
Because there's another part of that, right? And it's an economic part as well as a cultural part, which is that you are coming here specifically into a market. You are using your global Blackness to target the market, to break into the market, to want sales from the market. You're not targeting the white market. You're targeting the Black market. And so coming here and doing that in that very deliberate way without an understanding of the history, the culture, the terms, or anything, so that you don't even understand the resonance of it, is like any foundational Black person going into any other market, targeting a group of people in that market specifically because there is some resonance there, but then knowing nothing about anything except how to exploit that market.
You
And
mean
then
Drake with
wondering why,
Jamaicans?
yeah, anybody,
That was a good one.
and then wondering why people get angry.
Yeah.
So as we move into global markets, there is something that needs to happen for us all in terms of having some emotional and cultural understanding of what we're doing above and beyond exploiting the market. And I think that was part of the pushback, and that as we aspire to be more global, that's something that we all, regardless FBA or immigrant, need to keep in mind. Because if we don't do that, then we're just talking about economic exploitation. And how is that any different from a whiteness practice?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that really kind of, I think, brings us to so many topics, right? Because this is so many things that come up in this conversation, but definitely I think around, we know that the separation and what is happening by design, you know, the white supremacy nurtures a lot of that wedge. It causes that conflict and that tension. And I think it's going to be important on us to say, okay, how do we, you know, we know what's happening. How do we make sure that we're actually engaging with one another and learning one another and recognizing the tricks of the trade? So if I go to Jamaica, if I go to South Africa, and granted, I may not, you know everyone there, but me understanding the tricks of the trade, how does this work here? So I can find my people and be safe, and we can work together, we can collaborate. That's going to be, I think, of the utmost importance. And I think that, you know, social media has definitely helped. You know, I think with people kind of maybe learning and having those conversations and engaging and getting to know more about that, but that's certainly not the last piece. I'm gonna get to Tim, and then I'm gonna start to wrap us up as we close out for how do we continue these connections that we actually have. Go ahead, Tim. Sorry for having you so long.
No worries. Hey, everybody. Thank you for having me. Thank you for hosting the talk. I guess I just wanted to add my input on the point about Pan-Africanism and maybe why it hasn't kind of spread and sort of grown as much as maybe we would have liked. And I guess just I'm just, yeah, speaking from my personal experience. I just spent like the last like nearly 4 years like traveling around Africa. So I spent some time in Kenya, then Rwanda, Tanzania, and most recently came back from Ghana, which does have like a good, quite a large African American and Caribbean community there. I just give my inputs from my experience as to why it's not as big as it could be. I guess it's just coming from two ends. I guess from the end over in Africa, I guess, yeah, I know that there are some different African governments, like the Ghanaian government. I know with in Sierra Leone, if you can prove you belong to a particular Sierra Leonean tribe by taking an ancestry test, you can get citizenship there. So there are different governments that are kind of taking steps, but it's still happening at a really slow pace, and it's just kind of not as comprehensive and as organized as maybe you would expect. So that's what I was seeing on the side, like there in Africa. And yeah, I guess from the side, back in the USA or like other Western countries, and just going from my experience as like a Black Brit being in Africa in these different parts of the world, I guess, yeah, like others were saying before, there is a lot of ignorance that even Black people, part of the wider diaspora have about Africa. And it was something that was shocking where I'd go, you'd take the flight from whether I was taking a flight from the UK or even from the States, because I have family there as well, and you take it into, especially in Kenya and some of these other parts, and yeah, the plane's full of like white and like Asian people, and like I had to, I think, yeah, I didn't meet like throughout all my travels. I came in contact and made friends with a few in Ghana, but like when I was in Rwanda, Tanzania, Kenya, when you go to the spots that are maybe frequented by like, different expats or different groups, or you're in the major cities, yeah, it was very rare to kind of see, like it was lonely out there. Let's say that it got a bit cold and whatnot. But yeah, I guess that's maybe to do with I guess just not really knowing much, like having the most knowledge about these different countries. And I guess, yeah, I guess maybe moving forward, I guess it's figuring out how we can meet at the middle in terms of what is it that we can do as Blacks abroad to kind of like spread kind of bigger message, just informing our own selves about like Africa, African history, its cultures, and what Africa is like now in 2024. That's something I battle with a lot, where wherever I am, people, they have an image about Africa, and where they're like, oh, can I travel there? They're going to be hotels of like, you can book an Airbnb from here, like it's a new time. Yeah. So I guess, yeah, that'd be my take. And yeah, thank you. I've landed my plane. Thank you for listening.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. Yeah, I think that makes sense. That it's going to be, for one, I think folks educating themselves, and also like not looking, I think, thinking about a version of Africa that no longer exists or has never existed. That having an understanding of like what Africa is in 2024, understanding like the different governments and belief systems and the culture, all I think allows us to hopefully meet in the middle and to work together. But I did want to also, just like before we kind of start to wrap up, there are a lot of connections, right? We've talked about the Pan-African movement. We've talked about when Black immigrants are kind of having their kind of aha moments, like, oh wait, like I understand now what's going on. But like there are so many connections in our own history. We think about folks like Marcus Garvey or Kwame Ture, who have talked about, in the midst of their own work, like this kind of global, Pan-African connection between like Black Americans, folks on the continent, folks in the Caribbean, folks in other countries who are Black and us actually working together to educate ourselves. So that relationship is there, but I think it's going to take a lot more intentional work on our end to get that done. So I want to know from you all, for our wonderful panel, what else do you all think we have to do to really make sure we are working together, we're educating each other and educating ourselves? And what could that look like to move forward?
I can jump in.
Okay.
Because I'm thinking this conversation, a previous conversation was making me think about a conversation I had with my 7-year-old, who was born in America, but is very aware of her Caribbean heritage. And there's lots of layers there that we navigate, but we live in a very white community. And she's like, the only little Black girl in her all white class, second grade class. And her friends were having a conversation about traveling to Jamaica and I guess regurgitating what they heard their parents say, that Jamaica is one of the most dangerous places in like the world, right? And I was like, well, actually America's probably more dangerous than Jamaica, right? And she was like, I know, I told them like that's not true because we have Caribbean hair, right? Like she had this sense of pride, but also awareness, like that is not true. And so, thinking about as a mom actively raising children and trying to think about how are the ways that we can respect and honor the history of the country we live in, as well as the history of the country we came from, and how these worlds go together, I think is really important to shape that reshape, if you will, tell historical truths and the narrative so our children have that and are not perpetuating it. That's one. And I think the other thing is really continuing to hold spaces for these dialogues. And I think in particular away from the white gaze, so we can have really honest conversations about the ways we've internalized and, perpetuate and horizontal hostilities. I think we were supposed to talk about that as well,
Yeah.
right? The ways those shows up. So those are the two kind of things that came top of mind with that question.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's beautiful that she was like, that is not true. That is not it. That's really important, like to educate and to do that like with grace with people. I think that's going to be a lot of grace will be needed. Wendy.
I was just going to say, it's amazing how children can zoom right in and hear the truth. They just kind of peel away all the junk. I agree with everything Claire said, and I want to follow up with, and I think that we have so much to offer each other.
Mm-hmm.
This country in the fight for liberation, because those of us who are here now, and we are fully here, no matter what our citizenship status and all of that. When the stuff is going down, I'm going to where the Black people are, right? And I don't care if they're foundational Black Americans. I don't care if they're immigrants. I am going where those numbers are, where there's safety for me, right? But the other part of it is that we have so much to teach each other. I think there's a reason that all these divides are so carefully cultivated. Because just think about what would happen if Black immigrants and Black foundational Americans got together and shared our histories and what we know, right?
Mm-hmm.
Our histories have been parallel paths, but they kind of go like this,
Yeah.
right? If we when we begin to talk about our histories and our fights for liberation, we'll see that very similar, right? It's just that in this country, our children aren't being taught that in schools, right? They're not hearing that. We have to teach our kids that. But just think about what would happen if foundational Black Americans sort of brought that knowledge of all the systems and processes here that have worked and all the things that America has been successful with. And those of us who are Black immigrants come with, we've been running our own countries for a long time. What would it look like if we put all that knowledge together? How could we change this country, right? Because every immigrant that comes here has the opportunity to contribute or not to contribute.
Yeah.
Or we could do harm, right? There's very little in between. And so, what would happen if we put this all together and, built a path and a plan for what liberation in this country looks like?
Absolutely. Yeah. Anthony.
I was trying to go before Wendy. I knew she was about to creep on my answer. I
I'm
knew it.
sorry.
Sorry, buddy.
Yeah, but again, I'll say that blackness, anti-blackness is global, and really trying to think about this interconnectedness, right? That I think that we have been taught that anything related to anti-blackness is only operates in the United States, right?
Mhm.
But when we're looking at climate change, environmental racism, that is global. When we're talking about colonization, when we're talking about capitalism, genocide, right? And there's things that these cross conversations, these across countries, continents that we need to be having. We owe it to ourselves in this struggle to be having those and having those connected convos. And so that would be mine, and also something that I'm trying to be more committed to. So yeah.
Yeah. I think like for me it's definitely the conversations, having grace for each other in the conversations in the space, because look, surviving any place is difficult, but definitely, if you're a Black person trying to survive, it is hard. It is extremely hard to do all the things that you need to do, plus deal with the weight and the grief and the annoyance and all the other feelings of just trying to do it like while you are a Black person. And so I think if we could move past the, oh well, you know, nobody is being lazy. Like I've seen lazy people, and Black folks are not lazy. And getting past the stereotypes and really getting into some of the history, I think is going to be important. I think, and also deciding, I mean, at least in my head, deciding what does safety look like for us in this country? What does a community look like in this country for us? Because as we see, I think even in our current election, and depending on whoever gets into that White House, it's going to be important for us to recognize, like, how do we survive that? And we can't do that with infighting. We have to make sure, there's a wealth of information between all of us, and I would love to see all of us putting that in the pot and making some good stew, as opposed to being like, oh, we just over here, I got mine, you got yours, and that's how it all is. And that's just not the way I think it can work. And I think that when we get together, we find it, like, we find moments. Like, I think even for all the issues that, the convos that we had at Morgan that were kind of jarring, there were so many other moments that were like beautiful, right? Where we were able to come together, where we were able to find unity. And I think we have to find, like, not just the moments to dance, but to actually, I think, be politically minded, to like talk about the very hard things, and really being community in that way too. So I think it's gonna be, it's a battle, but it's a battle I think that we're actually up to, but we just gotta actually do it. So I really want to thank you all. This conversation could honestly go on for another, I don't know, like probably years. But I want to thank Anthony, Wendy, and Claire for their time on this beautiful Monday. You could have been anywhere, but you're here with us. I want to thank everyone who has either spoken in the chat or come off mute and spoken with us and shared their thoughts. We want to thank you for just kind of like, being honest and really talking about this topic in a way that hopefully can bring some change, can hopefully open people's minds. And I'm hoping we can do a part 2 or a part 3, because there's so many things we didn't even get to. Definitely around, I think, like children, like, and that kind of divide. Definitely around, I think, our education systems, and how that could, possibly play into all of this. So I'm hoping this is the beginning of multiple conversations. And I want to thank, Adar for even, I think, really kind of bringing up this topic. This is something I'm excited to talk more about. So thank you all for coming and having this conversation with us. We have some other like BRJA things coming up, so I'm going to ask Rebecca to share those. So join us for May's discussion on promotion and an ARAO, anti-racist, anti-oppressive workplace. That's next Tuesday, May 21st. May is moving, y'all. It's very quick. So we have that coming up. You can certainly use the QR code here if you're interested in attending that. And We hope to see you for our June 13th event. That topic and stuff will be released soon, but that's going to be on June 13th at 6 p.m. So I'm hoping you all are saving it on your calendar and it's something that you're interested in hearing. And check out our Eventbrite page for more information on all of our events. So you can do that, as well as checking out our YouTube and our stuff on other social media pages like Facebook, about upcoming events, as well as past events if you want to watch any of the old 13ths that we had there. We have a lot of wonderful, fun topics. So thank you once again for joining us, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your Monday. Thanks.
Thanks so much for the opportunity.
Yes, thank you
Yes,
all. It was a
thank
great
you.
conversation.
This was wonderful.